Okay. So we're in. Can you see the slides there?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. We got through all the theories last week. And I think we were on this slide or the next. You guys remember in your notes? Did we get past this? I don't think we did. Let's just.
The last thing we did was watch that video about John Adams.
And that had to do with the alien and sedition. Okay. So we probably are more like right here. And even if we did this slide, we'll go ahead and recapture, get our brains caught up. So one of the interesting things about the First Amendment is it sounds like it's an absolute right, and we've learned that it's not. Also, the meaning of the First Amendment, according to our Constitution and our government, is whatever the Supreme Court says it is. And even though we have this tremendous respect for speech and press and religion and assembly and petition, there's not absolute rights to it. And even though we believe in these things, there have been times through American history where we as a government have almost given away our rights in order to try to be more secure. So in times of war in particular. So the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798 is the first time America does that. The Bill of Rights is ratified in 1791, and 7 years later, John Adams signs into law the Alien and Sedition Act. And they were worried about wartime. They were a young country, and they were afraid that if they got in a war with France, and they have a bunch of French people in the colonies, that they might rise up from within the colonies and help defeat them. So part of the Alien and Sedition Act was meant to send people away who were not Americans by that definition. But it also made it false, scandalous, and malicious publications against the government illegal. So in other words, you couldn't criticize your government, which is the exact opposite of what the First Amendment was meant to do. You have an absolute, well, you have a right, maybe not absolute, to criticize your government. And so the Alien Sedition Act punished people who sought to stir up sedition or urge resistance to federal laws, although they might not really have been stirring up sedition. If I say, and I'm just going to say President X, because I don't attack a Republican or a Democrat, but if I come out really strongly and say President X is an idiot, maybe I'm not trying to do sedition, maybe I'm trying to get people's attention to see my point of view. And so sedition means I want somebody to overthrow our President X, who I don't respect very much, whoever it is. And so sedition is very different than criticism. But the Alien and Sedition Act is as un-American as anything a president signed into law. Adams did it in part because he never felt a tremendous amount of support. If you've ever watched a miniseries on John Adams, I really recommend it sometime in the summer when you're not super busy. There's like 8 episodes, something like that. You'll see that John Adams, without him, we might not have our country. That's how pivotal he was. He was an amazing guy, but he was kind of short, squat, unattractive, and had a real knack for rubbing people the wrong way. He wasn't the tall, handsome, erudite Washington or Jefferson. And so he often was overlooked in his day. He felt it too. He really felt he didn't get the credit due him. And so sometimes the criticisms that he had to endure did sting, and he didn't like them. And I suspect if you're tall, erudite, and handsome, you don't like them either. But for whatever reason, Adams was persuaded to sign this into law. And, fortunately, A couple years later, Thomas Jefferson becomes our third president, and this law needed to be renewed, and Jefferson let it die. So it died with our third president. But it's the first time, really, that the government kind of acts against the First Amendment. Okay, I'm sorry I said a bunch of this stuff, but Adams was a Federalist. In those days, what it meant is he believed in a strong centralized government. And Thomas Jefferson was a Republican, and that's not the Republican like we think of today. Abraham Lincoln founded the Republican Party we think of today. But the Republicans of the founding of the nation were people who believed in a less centralized government. They were afraid of a king coming up, and they were more states' rights kind of people. And Thomas Jefferson was a libertarian and would never in a million years have signed the Alien and Sedition Act. And they were kind of rivals. Matter of fact, Jefferson comes in and wins the presidency, and Adams does not serve a second term. The law was aimed at silencing the Federalists in the Jeffersonian political newspapers. So Adams really wanted it to apply to one kind of group because he already had the support of his group. Under this act, there were only 15 people prosecuted. Well, it's not like hundreds of people went to jail. But editors of 8 Jeffersonian newspapers went to jail. So can you imagine today if, again, President X or President Y could jail the journalists that wrote bad stuff about them? Let's just throw the New York Times in prison. Let's just throw the Washington Post in prison. And so while it's not a lot of people, it still kind of smacks in the face of what we're supposed to be about. Because just imagine if Jefferson had done it when he came in charge, then it would have been Federalists who were going to prison. And so you just can't have a country where whenever somebody comes into power, the other party goes to prison. In 1800, he lost re-election because he couldn't silence his critics. He tried, and there was some, but so one of the reasons he did it really was so he could retain office. That's very king-like. If you think back to those of you who had UI 382 or mass media history, when kings come to power, the first thing they try to do is control the press so they can keep the throne. And so it's very disturbing to see John Adams, who's better than that. I mean, he had great philosophies. To see John Adams want to keep his throne so bad that he attacks press freedom. It expired in 1801, and Jefferson pardoned all those who'd been convicted under the act, and he let the act die. So when it comes to press freedom anyway, Jefferson is much more friendly than Adams. So again, there was not actual war at this time, so much as there was kind of the fear of war. Well, this kind of scenario happens again when World War I rolls around. And when World War I's happening, people are really scared about security. And so Congress passes the Espionage Act of 1970. And they want to make sure that, Americans are for this war. So they made it a crime to willfully convey a false report with the intent to interfere with the war effort. So, in other words, if you committed willful fake news at the time of this era, it was a crime. Granted, it's unethical and you shouldn't do it, but it really shouldn't be a crime. It just is more of an ethical than a legal matter. A cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty. So in other words, they wanted Americans lockstep behind the World War I effort. And if you did anything that obstructed recruitment or enlistment of troops, it's a crime. And so, again, this was more about uniformity of thought behind the war effort. But it's the whole kind of controlling of thought that's kind of problematic. The truth is, if you study history, every single time America has gone to war, Americans have been behind it. Now, they have later maybe protested. Vietnam War lasted too long. People found things out. They protested. But pretty much, and maybe not lockstep. There have been, some people who are pacifists and things like that. The Sedition Act of 1918 made it a crime to obstruct the recruiting service. So if you wrote something that they perceived as disloyal or profane in order to keep people from joining the armed services, that's a crime. I mean, that doesn't even sound like our country. Granted, I'm not saying everybody needs to run out there and say profound things about the government or profane things, but making it a crime to say don't enlist, that's ridiculous. So thousands of newspapers, books, and pamphlets were censored under this act. So there was a lot more impact than the 15 people who were prosecuted and the 8 editors that went to jail. Those found to violate the act often lost government-subsidized second-class mailing privileges or found that their mail was never delivered. So why is that significant? A lot of publications, newspapers and magazines, in order to survive, get a special mailing rate. And so they can mail their publication to people. If that disappears, they can't really afford to be in business a lot of times. Or, almost worst case scenario, if they just kind of throw your publication in the mail, it never gets anywhere. So that's quite pervasive and has large tentacles that they're just looking at thousands and thousands of things and deciding, public doesn't need to see this. What's the problem with this is even if we could agree we should all be patriotic all the time, we probably can't agree what that means. And we can't agree what products and publications are anti-patriotic. And so it is not the place of the United States Post Office to throw publications away because they deem it unfit. So another thing that was distressing during this period is that the states themselves adopted statutes aimed at dissenters. So they passed I can pronounce that word, syndicalism. Who can say that word? Anybody? Syndicalism. There you go. You say it with a lot of authority really fast. Statutes that prohibited the display of red or black flag. So if a publication had a red or black flag somehow, they made that illegal. And so you had the state starting to squelch speech as well during World War I. So when the war is over, these practices go away. And so people's fears go away when we will help win the war. And I said this last time, I'm going to say it again. It was Benjamin Franklin who said, any man, and I'll say today, any person, who jettisons their liberty in pursuit of security deserves neither. And that's what all these cases are. They think erroneously that it's going to make them safer. So the Smith Act of 1940 is an act passed by Congress during World War II. So World War II follows on the heels of the First Great War. And not everybody was thrilled that we went to these wars. There's always somebody who preaches against it or speaks against it. So Congress passed a bill making it a crime. I'll do this with it. I don't know if this helps. But making it a crime to advocate, conspire, the violent overthrow of the government. That sounds pretty reasonable, right? Who should say, you know, throw them out of their ear, shoot them, whatever. I mean, I'm not for inciting violence, but it also seems to me that who determines what's violent and who determines. So it made it a crime to organize a group that advocated the violent overthrow of the government, or be a member of a group that advocated the violent overthrow of the government. We see in McCarthyism in the 1950s, one of the problems with things like this is that all somebody has to do is kind of accuse you of it. You don't have to be guilty of it. And so unless somebody actually inspires people to violence, just writing something that's strong and passionate itself really shouldn't be a crime. But the Smith Act made it one during the war. I'm sorry, I had to reread that because it looks like the wrong date, but it's not. So what it's saying is that when the World Trade Center bombing happened, what some states did is they went all the way back to laws on the Civil War books and used it to prosecute people for sedition. And so they were using really antiquated laws to deal with that because the World Trade Center bombing, they conspired to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States. So the 1990s, I'm thinking that's the first World Trade Center bombing, not 9/11. And so some people tried to squelch terrorist attacks with that. So in 2006, a federal judge allowed charges to proceed under the Espionage Act of 1917 when two former lobbyists for the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee obtained classified defense info and communicated it to Israeli officials. So there was a court case where they found this information, it was classified, and they passed it on. And the judges said that they could use the Espionage Act of 1917 against these folks. So one of the problems with putting these things on the books is sometimes they're used for different things. The clear and present danger test. One of the things that the court has to do is balance robust speech and expression and things like that with, you know, the right to keep us safe. I'm not saying that some things might not be necessary. For instance, forgive the Eisenhower reference, I'm not going to do that too much in this class. But when Eisenhower was president, one of the things he was really worried about was the Soviet Union and the Russians blowing us up. We were the two world superpowers. So he initiated a satellite program. Even though they launched Sputnik before us, we were doing classified work creating satellites so we could spy on the Russians. And Eisenhower never told anybody about it because he didn't want the Russians to know we were spying on them. And so that's an example of something that you wouldn't necessarily want people to report, classified kind of information. So in Holmes and Schenck, that's actually just this Oliver Wendell Holmes and Schenck in 1919, came up with this clear and present danger test because they were trying to define the limits of freedom of expression. And he wrote in the opinion, but the character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it is done. So, you know, we talked before about de facto cases where you take cases on a case-by-case basis. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. It is a question of proximity and of degree. So if what you're communicating is so near and so severe that it will wreak real havoc on the country, then Congress or some government entity might be able to limit your speech. Now the problem again is, who's doing the deciding? Oh, it does seem to me that the government should have some ability to limit our speech if it is a true, clear, and present danger. And that's what this test does. The Pentagon papers that were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg would not meet this standard because it really created no clear and present danger. It was a historical study about the Vietnam War, and it embarrassed the president, but it didn't pose a threat to the country. If I had the plans for where all our nuclear sites were, and I decided to sell that for a profit, I'd hope they'd throw me away and throw away the key, put me in jail. And so the whole notion is, if there's a true, clear, and present danger, I can limit your expression. Any questions? It all makes sense on PowerPoint slides. It's really hard when they have to decide the actual cases. Like, okay, clear and present danger. Yeah. What? Yeah, Ellsberg?
Yeah. So like, he was doing it for a good reason. Did it actually pass this or not?
Ellsberg?
Yeah.
Ellsberg was eventually released because what happened was it kind of got tied in a little bit with Watergate, not to go too far afield. But the Nixon administration, whether or not Nixon himself ordered it or just people who worked for Nixon, broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist office. Daniel Ellsberg, when he came back from Vietnam, because he went there to observe, he had post-traumatic stress disorder. And he had it pretty severe. So he ended up going to a psychiatrist to try to deal with what he saw in Vietnam. And so Nixon's people broke in to get dirt on Ellsberg, and they got caught. He just hired the, and whether or not the president did it or just his administration, they just hired the worst burglars because they just got caught. And so the court finally said, look, it's clear that the government is stacking the case against you. The president's out for you, so they just let him off the hook. So he, even though he stood trial briefly, he was let go, but not really because they found him innocent so much as they felt like he couldn't get a fair trial if the President of the United States is breaking into your psychiatrist's office to discredit you or his people. Nixon may not have bothered with that detail. But I think historians would say, and people who've examined this, that what Ellsberg did would not meet this test. And the reason is the Pentagon papers talked about how we got in the war, how we escalated the war. It started with Eisenhower and went through Nixon. And it talked about historical decisions, but it didn't have troop movements. And it didn't have anything that would help the enemy defeat us. And so I would say that it probably would not have been ruled a clear and present danger. And that's what most people, especially with hindsight of history, think about it. Now, WikiLeaks, I don't know. He thinks he did it for the right reason too. I can see both sides of that argument. He actually leaked stuff we were doing in real time. He thought the American people had a right to know. I'm not sure he's wrong. But that, I think, is a closer case. And I think that's why, where's he's at? He's still out of the country, right?
Like Russia.
Yeah, so he won't come back because he's afraid of being prosecuted. But was he a hero for revealing what America was doing? I don't know. I think everybody kind of has to decide that one on their own. Daniel Ellsberg, what he did, you could argue, hastened the end of Vietnam. And so you could argue that maybe he saved lives. He did violate trust. He got the Rand Corporation, which is where he worked. He got his boss and his company in all kinds of trouble. So, in another case, they look at the clear and present danger test in 1951. Sometimes what the Supreme Court will do is they'll take a case because they want to tweak a precedent, or they want to kind of refine what's precedent. And in this one, the Chief Justice said that there's a clear and probable danger test. Okay. Seems like just a word, right? A clear and probable danger test. What does the word probable do?
I guess if it's likely to occur.
Yeah, it kind of tips it a little bit more in the favor of squelching the speech. A little bit. Because I think if it's clear and present danger, that's a higher standard than clear and probable danger. So it's almost like, and this is my interpretation, that I don't have a law degree like Dr. Buck, so I might ask her this one day. But you know, the difference between if you're on a criminal trial, it's guilty by reasonable doubt, very high standard. If it's a civil trial, by a preponderance of the evidence. So it's a lesser, this is almost just a slightly lesser standard for me to squelch your speech. And it may be in 1951, the fear of communism, the era of red baiting, maybe they felt like they just needed to do this. It still gives quite a bit of protection. The quote from the decision says, in each case, courts must ask whether the gravity of the evil, discounted by its improbability, justifies such invasion of free speech as is necessary to avoid the danger. So still protecting speech there, but maybe just ever so slightly says, you know, if it's a probability versus a clear danger, then maybe we can squelch some speech. So in 1969, we look at it again. In Brandenburg versus Ohio, there's a court case, and they decide, according to the Supreme Court or the High Court, that the constitutional guarantees of free speech and free press do not permit a state to forbid or prescribe advocacy of, they always have to sound like lawyers, right? Advocacy of the use of force or of law violation, except where such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawlessness, lawless action, and is likely to incite or produce such actions. What's the difference in that language? You think? Inciting or producing imminent lawless action. It's almost making it a little tougher again. I don't know. I mean, this is my interpretation. But it took the word probable out. And it's, you know, if it's imminent lawlessness or incite such actions, that's a pretty strong thing to have to prove, I think. You can see how hard the court grapples with this because they really don't want to take away your right to free speech, but they don't want your free speech to end the country. So, The Brandenburg test, which is the one we just read, is a test for incitement to violence, is used by the courts in wrongful death cases, negligence and product liability lawsuits. So if you incite somebody to commit an act that leads to a wrongful death, which that doesn't happen often, but it has happened some, then they use this same kind of test for those cases. There was a court case, well, this has happened so long ago, but any of you guys know about the Ginny Jones case? You know who Ginny Jones is? That's how long it's been. Ginny Jones had a daytime talk show, and it wasn't nearly as respectable as Oprah's. It was a little bit more like Jerry Springer's, but maybe a little more respectable than that. And Ginny Jones, and this is also before a lot of people came out, people felt comfortable coming out of the closet. So I can't remember the years, but it was still much more of a stigma. And the Ginny Jones show decided to have an episode in which they revealed a surprise crush. And so a person was invited on the show, and they were going to find out who their surprise crush was, but they didn't know. And it was a man, I can't remember their names, I didn't really look it up. If you Google it, you can read more about it. But the man on the show, they kind of talked and set it up, and then one of his best friends comes out, another man, and finally he reveals, I'm the one who has a crush on you, I'm in love with you. It really incensed the man who was the guest because he was straight, he didn't know, he was embarrassed because it was on national TV. And he acted not too badly in front of the cameras, but when they both went home, the straight guy ended up killing the guy who professed his love to him. And it was just one of those things. He didn't do it right away. I don't even know what provoked it, but he went over and he killed him. So Ginny Jones got sued for negligence and wrongful death because the way they handled it, it was handled to make maximum embarrassment, maximum shock. And I don't even remember the outcome, but I just remember that the case in terms of, I don't think she fared very well. And the man, of course, went to prison for, I don't know what degree murder or if it was manslaughter, but he went to prison for doing it. And so this is on the book for that kind of thing, which isn't that common, or maybe the misuse of a product in some way that might kill a person, that kind of thing. You know, when they say don't do this at home, that's because somebody has done that kind of thing before and caused harm. Now I'm gonna have to look up the Ginny Jones case and send it to you guys, so you can read about how it concluded. A lot of media products have been challenged in court, or things like movies that have been very damaging, or video games, or books like, you know, How to Become a Hitman. I'm not even gonna name the service, but there is a program right now about people contemplating suicide. So I'm like, well, why is that on the air? Why can you stream that? Because, yeah, I don't know, it just seems like not a good thing to do. So there have been court cases involving things that have ended up causing problems for people. And so there have been regulations. And the court said, you know, you can't really blame a movie for something somebody maybe does. So in order for the court to come in and say your product is unsafe, they have to reach what's called strict scrutiny, which is a very, very high standard. Strict scrutiny means there has to be a compelling state interest at stake in order for your freedom of speech to be curtailed. The state or municipality must prove that it has a compelling interest that justify regulating a game, or the regulation restricts no more speech than is absolutely necessary to serve the allegedly compelling interest. And so, and there have been some pretty horrific games. I mean, sure, it makes parenting harder, making sure your kids don't watch them. But still, there has to be some kind of high standard before you just eliminate a product. I looked at a lot of stuff. Anybody have any questions? There's something that was called the Gitlow ruling and the corporation doctrine. So there were cases involving speech in the press and the 14th Amendment. So basically this ruling said that freedom of speech is also protected by the 14th Amendment as well as the First Amendment. That the First Amendment has been incorporated through the 14th Amendment, which is the due process clauses, as fundamental liberties to apply to state and local authorities, entities and officials, not just to Congress. So what? Okay, so the 14th Amendment gives you due process in the legal system. And it's saying that basically the First Amendment freedoms are part of that due process. Near versus Minnesota. I think I have briefly touched on this, but we're going to touch on it again. This is the first state court case involving prior restraint. There was a big state case, Near versus Minnesota in 1931, and then we have the Pentagon Papers case in the 1970s. In Near versus Minnesota, this court case goes all the way to the Supreme Court because at this point, the Supreme Court does not have a precedence for what it's supposed to do with prior restraint. I don't know if you remember, but many, many slides ago and a couple of classes ago, I said that at a bare minimum, when the founders adopted the Constitution and ratified the Bill of Rights, that at a minimum it meant prior restraint was un-American. That there was no reason for prior restraint. Well, Near versus Minnesota says maybe that's a little too much. And so in this case, they decide whether or not prior restraint can happen. So what happened was there was a guy named Jay Near and Howard Goldfuller, and they were publishers of the Saturday Press. And they published articles attacking corrupt city government officials and basically kind of calling them officials. It wasn't great journalism. It wasn't, they weren't considered the greatest journalists of their day or anything, but they were not afraid to take on power and to criticize them. And one of the things that they did is they printed the name of every state official that they knew who violated prohibition. And so the prohibition, drinking is outlawed, but some state people, state officials were still drinking, and it really was an embarrassment. But you can see if we published, I don't know, name a state official from Missouri during this time, so-and-so was drinking, it'd be embarrassing, but it's not really a compelling state interest either. It's not really a clear and present danger. But the court took this case because there was a Minnesota statute that empowered courts to declare any obscene, lewd, lascivious, malicious, scandalous, or defamatory publication a public nuisance. So state officials came in using this state law to say Near versus Minnesota cannot publish anymore and shut them down. The Saturday Press was declared a public nuisance. It was enjoined from printing any further editions of their paper. First time this has happened at the state level, ever. So, well, okay, before we get to this. So, going the wrong direction, there we go. So, the Supreme Court says that state statute is unconstitutional. And it rules in the favor of Deere and says they can keep publishing. And not only can they keep publishing, but the only time prior restraint can happen is if they are revealing troop movements in the time of war. I think one was like obscenity. You couldn't publish, pornography and obscenity are legally not the same thing. When we get to that chapter, what you'll find is pornography is legally protected. Obscenity is not. I don't know, I'm not a Supreme Court justice. Justice Barbara Stewart said, I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. Then when the Supreme Court came in and said that pretty much prior restraint for embarrassing public officials is not allowed. And so that was a huge court case in defense of religious freedom. And then in the 1971, so 40 years later, we have the first federal stop the presses ever by the government. And it's with the Pentagon Papers case. And so the Supreme Court stepped in here because what it happened was and no president in American history has ever done that before or since. And so the High Court felt like they had to step in. And in a 6-3 decision in favor of the New York Times and the Washington Post, they let the Pentagon Papers continue to be printed. Which also goes to your response before, which probably means the High Court would have released Daniel Ellsberg in the end if they'd gone before them. So the court did not say the Times and Post had a First Amendment right to print this story, just that the government failed to show the court in such a restraint should be imposed on the paper. So it's not so much that they ruled that the papers should be able to, so much as the government didn't prove its case. And so the government had to prove that it was some kind of danger, clear and present danger, and it didn't do so. How many of you guys have seen The Post? Oh my gosh, you have to watch The Post. It's a must. It's historically pretty accurate, I think. And it's got Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep. It's a real produced movie. And I know that I'm a geek and a nerd, but at this moment in the movie where they call in the decision and read over the phone what the justices say about the First Amendment, I cried. I know it's ridiculous. But it's a really, really moving movie if you really care about the First Amendment. So over Christmas break or over holiday break, I recommend that you watch it. I think you can watch it. If not on Netflix, I think it's on Amazon. So we have the 1931 Deere versus Minnesota, 1971 Pentagon Papers case, and then in 1979 we have the United States versus the Progressive magazine. And what the United States did in this case was they issued a preliminary injunction stopping publication of a magazine that carried an article that basically kind of told you how to construct a hydrogen bomb. Okay. Now, I'm not sure that many people would go to Walmart and get the ingredients and build a hydrogen bomb, but this particular article said, these are the 3 things you need to know in order to build one. And the government's like, that's insane. We do not need to be publishing how to make a hydrogen bomb. So 8 years later, the same magazine had another injunction against it because they wanted to tell people how to make thermonuclear weapons. Like, okay, seems to me, I'm about as far for the First Amendment as you can get. That seems like, why would you want to publish that? The decision was of little precedent-setting value. But it was the opinion of only one federal district court judge, not an appellate court. Before the decision worked its way up to the appellate court ladder, a newspaper in Wisconsin published the same information, thus rendering the case moot. I don't know. I might have, if I was the editor of those publications, I probably would not have published that material myself. But somebody in Wisconsin published it, making this case moot, and as far as I know, nobody built a nuclear war after reading that article. But this one, I think, has a lot more potential danger than a history study of the Pentagon Papers, but this is our last slide of the day, which is hard to believe, isn't it? But there was the United States versus Bell. And basically there was an appellate court that upheld a permanent injunction. Okay, you can get temporary injunctions, but a permanent one means that Thurston Paul Bell was barred permanently from promoting and selling unlawful tax advice on the website. In this case, he was giving out tax advice that wasn't true, and it was actually illegal. So somebody came in and said, you know, this guy can't be giving illegal tax advice. And so they ruled that prior restraints bear a heavy presumption against their constitutional validity, does not apply to restriction on unprotected speech, including false or unlawful commercial speech. But in this case, what this guy was doing was harmful to people. If they took his advice, they might misfile their taxes, they might do something. So they did kind of uphold a permanent injunction. And this did not go all the way to the Supreme Court. It went to a higher appellate court, but not to the highest court in the land. Well, believe it or not, that's the end of chapter 2. Whew, 3 weeks on it. Any questions about that? If not, do you guys have any questions about the first part of chapter 3? I can pull it up if I need to, but did you guys, you were supposed to listen to the first half of chapter 3. We can also deal with all of chapter 3 next week if you want to. Any questions about anything? This class we have a paper due, don't we? That's coming due, anybody remember, like October 15th-ish, October 30th-ish, something like that. Let me look at the syllabus here. We never have talked about the paper. This might take a few minutes to do that today, just so you can start thinking about it. Research 400 points. It's due October 30th in this class. And what I want you to do for your research paper is you can really write about anything you want to. It needs to be 5 pages. So in that sense, it's not a serious research paper in that like 10, 15, 20 pages, that kind of thing. But I just want you to write 5 good pages on any topic that we cover related to the First Amendment. I want you to have a minimum of 5 sources, 1 per page, in addition to the textbook. So if you use a textbook, you need 5 other sources. I say on here, I want you to pick a case and write about it. That's one way, but you can also just pick an issue if you want to. If you want to pick something like the limits of free expression and talk about 5 or 6 cases, the one thing you will want to do is kind of narrow, because even though 5 pages 80 sounds like a lot. In order to write on some of these topics, you're going to want to kind of narrow it. So why don't you, for next Monday, do one more thing that's not on the Moodle page? Why don't you just explore the topic you're interested in? And on next Monday, we'll share ideas. And if you can't think of anything, maybe as a class we can help you. Yeah.
Can it be like a topic that shows up in multiple cases or just pick one singular case?
No, I think it could be a topic that shows up in, like, prior restraint with multiple cases. Also, I know you guys are different option students. So like if there's advertising people in here, TV people, if you want to pick something germane to your area, that's okay. You don't have to. But you can do that. So try to come to class Monday, just prepared to tell us what the topic is, and maybe a non-committal thesis. You know, once you do your research, you might change it. But I want to write about this, and this is what I might say, just to kind of get you thinking about it, because October 30th will be here for we turn around. Think about that. And I think I'm going to let you go. I know we're supposed to be here 15 more minutes, but I think we're done for the day. We've covered what we need to. Read chapter 4 for Monday, and don't forget to do your form. Okay. Okay. See you guys. See you.
See ya.